You didn't just ignore the retreat signal. You lifted a telescope to your blind eye and told them you couldn't see it. Welcome back to brutal history for Sleep, where the heroes limp, bleed, and disobey orders, and still get statues. If you enjoy softly narrated chaos, kindly like, subscribe, and tell us where in the world you're watching from and what hour of the night Treason usually finds you. Thank you for helping this strange little channel grow. Tonight, you disobey every command, lose an eye, then an arm, and finally your life, but only after becoming the most beloved war hero in Britain. You die exactly how you wanted, dramatically, on a deck soaked in gunpowder, while everyone cheers. Close your eyes. The fire crackles softly. Your breathing slows. The sheets are warm. Your limbs are heavy, and your mind is already drifting, not away, but back. Back to the rocking of a wooden ship beneath your boots, the scent of salt, sweat, and the distant tang of cannon smoke. A silk sash tight across your uniform. The deck is polished, the sky is clean, and every man aboard looks to you like you're a prophet or a curse. You've written your orders. You've dressed for death. Now all that's left is to sail directly into it. The year was 1758, and England had just welcomed another sickly child into the world, one who would grow up to terrorize Napoleon's navy while missing significant portions of his own body. Little Horatio Nelson arrived pale, weak, and already exhibiting an alarming tendency toward melodrama that would define his entire career. His father was a rector who specialized in long sermons and longer silences. His mother died when Horatio was 9, leaving him with an inheritance of chronic seasickness and an unshakable belief that destiny had personally selected him for greatness. By age 12, young Nelson had convinced his uncle to secure him a place aboard HMS Reasonable, where he would learn the fine art of vomiting over the side of a ship, while simultaneously barking orders that nobody particularly wanted to follow. The Royal Navy of 1770 was not, shall we say, a gentle introduction to adulthood. Nelson found himself scrubbing decks, learning knots, and discovering that his stomach had apparently been designed by someone with a particularly cruel sense of humour. While other boys his age were learning Latin and deportment, Nelson was mastering the delicate skill of staying upright during a storm, while cannonballs whistled overhead. He took to it with the sort of enthusiasm that worried his superiors and delighted his enemies. By 15, Nelson had already served in the West Indies, survived malaria, and developed what his commanding officers politely described as an independent spirit. This was naval code for the boy keeps volunteering for missions that should reasonably kill him. Nelson had apparently misunderstood the concept of self-preservation entirely, treating danger like a personal invitation to demonstrate his worthiness. His early romantic life followed a similar pattern of dramatic overreach. At 20, Nelson fell desperately in love with a woman in Quebec who had the good sense to decline his marriage proposal. He responded to this rejection by throwing himself even more recklessly into his naval duties, as if cannon fire might cure a broken heart. It was a strategy he would repeat throughout his life, with mixed results. The young lieutenant spent his early 20s bouncing between the Caribbean and the Mediterranean, collecting tropical diseases and minor victories with equal enthusiasm. He commanded small vessels with the sort of aggressive confidence that made his crews simultaneously admire and fear him. Nelson had developed a peculiar talent for inspiring loyalty among men who were reasonably certain he would get them all killed eventually. In 1787 he married Frances Nisbet, a widow with a son and the sort of practical disposition that should have balanced his theatrical tendencies. Instead, Nelson treated marriage like another posting, dutiful but temporary. Frances would spend most of their union wondering where her husband had disappeared to this time, and why he insisted on writing her letters filled with references to glory, duty, and his own imminent death. By 1793, war with France had erupted again, and Nelson found himself aboard HMS Agamemnon, where he could finally indulge his talent for creative insubordination on a proper scale. He sailed for the Mediterranean with the sort of eager anticipation that most people reserved for holidays. For Nelson, war wasn't a grim necessity, it was a career opportunity. The siege of Calvi in Corsica provided Nelson with his first significant injury, and his first taste of how dramatically he could respond to losing body parts. A French cannonball sent stone fragments flying into his right eye, permanently damaging his sight. A reasonable person might have considered this a sign to perhaps step back from the front lines. Nelson, however, interpreted it as evidence that fate wanted him to become more visually distinctive. He continued commanding his men while half glum, developing a habit of turning his good eye toward whatever required his attention with theatrical deliberation. The injury gave him a perpetual squint that somehow made him look both more intimidating and more romantic, an effect he would exploit shamelessly for the rest of his career. The loss of sight in his right eye barely slowed Nelson down. If anything, it seemed to convince him that he was personally protected by Providence and could therefore take even greater risks. He volunteered for every dangerous mission, led every charge, and generally behaved like a man who had confused military service with performance art. In 1797, at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, Nelson demonstrated the sort of tactical brilliance that would make him famous, and the sort of reckless abandon that would make his superiors reach for their medicine bottles. When the Spanish fleet threatened to escape, Nelson left his position in the line, technically abandoning his post, and sailed directly into the enemy formation. It worked spectacularly, earning him a knighthood and confirming his belief that rules were more like suggestions. But it was at Tenerife that Nelson truly perfected his talent for dramatic injury. Leading an assault on the Spanish-held port, he caught a musket ball in his right elbow that shattered the joint beyond repair. As his men carried him back to the ship, Nelson calmly instructed the surgeon to amputate his arm immediately, without anaesthetic, because he had letters to write and a battle to finish. The amputation took place on the deck of HMS Theseus, with Nelson biting down on a leather strap and maintaining what witnesses described as remarkable composure while the surgeon sawed through bone. Within 30 minutes of losing his arm, Nelson was back on his feet, dictating orders with his remaining hand and inquiring about the progress of the assault. The attack failed, but Nelson's reputation for supernatural resilience was now permanently established. He learned to write with his left hand with the same methodical determination he brought to everything else, developing a spidery scrawl that would become famous throughout the Royal Navy. His letters home to Francis became increasingly dramatic, filled with references to his sacrifice for king and country, and his growing certainty that death in battle would be both glorious and inevitable. The missing arm became Nelson's signature accessory. He pinned the empty sleeve of his uniform to his chest, creating a visual reminder of his dedication that also happened to make him look dashingly tragic. Ladies at social gatherings found him irresistibly romantic, while enemy commanders learned to recognize his distinctive silhouette with growing unease. By 1798, Nelson had established himself as the Royal Navy's most reliable combination of tactical genius and walking medical emergency. He was promoted to Rear Admiral, given command of a squadron, and sent to the Mediterranean with instructions to find and destroy the French fleet. It was exactly the sort of mission that suited his particular talents: vague objectives, enormous risks, and the promise of either spectacular victory or spectacular death. As his ship sailed toward what would become the Battle of the Nile, Nelson stood on deck with his one good eye fixed on the horizon, his empty sleeve fluttering in the Mediterranean breeze. He had already lost an eye and an arm in service to his country, but he was just getting started. The man who would become Britain's greatest naval hero was still, at heart, the sickly boy who had joined the Navy at 12, except now he was missing significant body parts and had developed an addiction to mortal danger that bordered on the pathological. Chapter 2: Death, Disobedience, and a Full-Frontal Charge. The Mediterranean summer of 1798 found Rear Admiral Nelson pursuing the French fleet with the sort of methodical obsession that characterized all his best work. Napoleon had sailed east with an enormous invasion force, and Nelson had been tasked with stopping him. The only problem was that nobody seemed to know exactly where Napoleon had gone, leaving Nelson to chase rumours across the entire eastern Mediterranean like a bloodhound with navigational charts. For 6 weeks, Nelson's squadron swept back and forth across waters that stretched from Spain to Egypt, stopping at every port to ask if anyone had seen 40,000 French soldiers recently. The search was becoming embarrassing. Nelson had expected to find the French fleet anchored somewhere obvious, ready for a proper battle. Instead, he was playing an enormous game of naval hide-and-seek, while Napoleon conquered Egypt at his leisure. The British Admiralty had given Nelson remarkably vague instructions: find the French, destroy them, and try not to start any diplomatic incidents in the process. These were the sort of orders that appealed to Nelson's independent spirit, since they essentially gave him permission to do whatever he thought best across roughly half the known world. He interpreted this freedom as license for increasingly creative tactical decisions. On August 1st, Nelson's lookouts finally spotted the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile. Admiral Broyes had positioned his ships in what appeared to be an impregnable defensive line, anchored close to shore with their guns facing seaward. It was a textbook defensive formation that should have forced any attacking fleet to sail directly into concentrated French firepower. A reasonable admiral would have waited until morning to attack, allowing time to study the French positions and coordinate a proper assault. Nelson, of course, was not particularly reasonable. He took one look at the French formation and immediately spotted its fatal weakness. Broyes had anchored his ships with enough space between them and the shore for an enemy to slip through. It was a gap that existed only because the French admiral had assumed no one would be crazy enough to attempt such a maneuver in shallow, unfamiliar waters at sunset. Nelson gathered his captains and explained his plan with the sort of casual confidence that made his subordinates wonder if he had actually considered the risks involved. Half the British fleet would attack the French from the expected seaward side, while the other half would sail between the French ships and the shore, catching them in a devastating crossfire. It was brilliant, suicidal, and exactly the sort of tactic that Nelson favoured. The attack began at sunset, with HMS Goliath leading the British ships through the gap Nelson had identified. The French crews were caught completely off guard. Many were ashore gathering supplies, while others were eating dinner. Suddenly, British ships were firing at them from both sides simultaneously, turning their defensive line into a death trap. Nelson's flagship, HMS Vanguard, sailed directly into the heart of the French formation, where it promptly collided with the enemy ship Spartiate. The two vessels became entangled, allowing their crews to engage in the sort of close-quarters combat that naval officers usually tried to avoid. Nelson stood on his quarterdeck, directing the battle with his one good arm, while cannonballs whistled around his head with alarming frequency. At approximately 9 o'clock, a piece of French grape shot caught Nelson in the forehead, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding with dramatic abundance. The wound was superficial. The shot had glanced off his skull rather than penetrating, but head injuries bleed spectacularly, and Nelson was soon covered in blood from his hairline to his collar. His officers rushed to assist him, but Nelson waved them away with characteristic melodrama, declaring that he was perfectly capable of continuing to command while bleeding. He had a battle to win, and a head wound was hardly going to stop him now. The ship's surgeon attempted to bandage the injury, but Nelson kept pulling off the dressing to better observe the action around him. The battle reached its climax when the French flagship L'Orient caught fire. The ship carried the fleet's entire supply of gold and ammunition, making it essentially a floating bomb waiting for ignition. As flames spread across the vessel, both British and French ships began backing away, recognizing that the explosion would be visible from several countries. L'Orient detonated at 10 o'clock with a blast that shattered windows in Alexandria, 20 miles away. The explosion was so tremendous that it briefly stopped the entire battle, as sailors from both fleets paused to appreciate the sheer spectacle of a ship completely ceasing to exist. Burning debris rained down for several minutes, starting small fires on nearby vessels, and generally reminding everyone involved that naval warfare could be unpredictably dramatic. Nelson watched the explosion from his quarterdeck, blood still streaming down his face, and reportedly commented that it was a sight that reminded one of the Judgment Day. His officers were less philosophical, mostly concerned with avoiding the chunks of flaming wreckage that were falling around them like apocalyptic confetti. By morning, the French fleet had been almost entirely destroyed. 11 ships had been captured or sunk, with only 4 managing to escape. Napoleon's invasion force was now stranded in Egypt, cut off from reinforcement or retreat. The victory was so complete that Nelson could hardly believe it himself, sitting in his cabin, writing dispatches while his surgeon finally managed to properly dress his head wound. The Battle of the Nile established Nelson as a national hero and confirmed his reputation for tactical brilliance combined with supernatural luck. He had disobeyed standard naval doctrine, attacked at the worst possible time, and achieved a victory so decisive that it changed the entire strategic balance in the Mediterranean. The British public was delighted, the Admiralty was impressed, and Napoleon was reportedly furious enough to throw furniture. Nelson's letters home after the battle were characteristically dramatic, filled with references to divine providence and his own miraculous survival. He described his head wound as a most severe contusion and assured Francis that he was perfectly recovered, despite the fact that he was still experiencing headaches and dizziness weeks later. The injury would leave him with a permanent scar across his forehead, which he would display like a badge of honor for the rest of his life. The victory also brought Nelson his first taste of international celebrity. Cities across Europe named streets after him, poets wrote odes to his courage, and portrait artists competed to capture his distinctive profile, complete with eye patch and battle scars. Nelson discovered that he rather enjoyed being famous, and began cultivating his image with the sort of attention to detail that most people reserved for their appearance at court. As his squadron sailed toward Naples for repairs and celebration, Nelson stood once again on his quarterdeck, his head wrapped in fresh bandages, his empty sleeve pinned to his chest. He had just achieved the greatest naval victory in British history, while suffering what should have been a serious head injury. It was exactly the sort of performance that defined his career. Brilliant, reckless, and just dramatic enough to become legendary. The hero of the Nile was about to discover that fame brought its own complications, particularly when combined with his tendency toward romantic melodrama and his complete inability to follow conventional social rules. But for now, sailing toward Naples with the wreckage of the French fleet scattered behind him, Nelson could enjoy the simple satisfaction of a job spectacularly well done. The Mediterranean summer of 1798 found Rear Admiral Nelson pursuing the French fleet with the sort of methodical obsession that characterized all his best work. Napoleon had sailed east with an enormous invasion force, and Nelson had been tasked with stopping him. The only problem was that nobody seemed to know exactly where Napoleon had gone, leaving Nelson to chase rumours across the entire eastern Mediterranean like a bloodhound with navigational charts. For 6 weeks, Nelson's squadron swept back and forth across waters that stretched from Spain to Egypt, stopping at every port to ask if anyone had seen 40,000 French soldiers recently. The search was becoming embarrassing. Nelson had expected to find the French fleet anchored somewhere obvious, ready for a proper battle. Instead, he was playing an enormous game of naval hide-and-seek, while Napoleon conquered Egypt at his leisure. The British Admiralty had given Nelson remarkably vague instructions: find the French, destroy them, and try not to start any diplomatic incidents in the process. These were the sort of orders that appealed to Nelson's independent spirit, since they essentially gave him permission to do whatever he thought best across roughly half the known world. He interpreted this freedom as license for increasingly creative tactical decisions. Sometimes these amazingly creative tactical decisions. On August 1st, Nelson's lookouts finally spotted the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile. Admiral Bruy had positioned his ships in what appeared to be an impregnable defensive line, anchored close to shore with their guns facing seaward. It was a textbook defensive formation that should have forced any attacking fleet to sail directly into concentrated French firepower. A reasonable admiral would have waited until morning to attack, allowing time to study the French positions and coordinate a proper assault. Nelson, of course, was not particularly reasonable. He took one look at the French formation and immediately spotted its fatal weakness. Bruy had anchored his ships with enough space between them and the shore for an enemy to slip through. It was a gap that existed only because the French admiral had assumed no one would be crazy enough to attempt such a maneuver in shallow, unfamiliar waters at sunset. Nelson gathered his captains and explained his plan, with the sort of casual confidence that made his subordinates wonder if he had actually considered the risks involved. Half the British fleet would attack the French from the expected seaward side, while the other half would sail between the French ships and the shore, catching them in a devastating crossfire. It was brilliant, suicidal, and exactly the sort of tactic that Nelson favoured. The attack began at sunset, with HMS Goliath leading the British ships through the gap Nelson had identified. The French crews were caught completely off guard. Many were ashore gathering supplies, while others were eating dinner. Suddenly, British ships were firing at them from both sides simultaneously, turning their defensive line into a death trap. Nelson's flagship, HMS Vanguard, sailed directly into the heart of the French formation, where it promptly collided with the enemy ship Spartiate. The two vessels became entangled, allowing their crews to engage in the sort of close-quarters combat that naval officers usually tried to avoid. Nelson stood on his quarterdeck, directing the battle with his one good arm, while cannonballs whistled around his head with alarming frequency. At approximately 9 o'clock, a piece of French grape shot caught Nelson in the forehead, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding with dramatic abundance. The wound was superficial. The shot had glanced off his skull rather than penetrating, but head injuries bleed spectacularly, and Nelson was soon covered in blood from his hairline to his collar. His officers rushed to assist him, but Nelson waved them away with characteristic melodrama, declaring that he was perfectly capable of continuing to command while bleeding. He had a battle to win, and a head wound was hardly going to stop him now. The ship's surgeon attempted to bandage the injury, but Nelson kept pulling off the dressing to better observe the action around him. The battle reached its climax when the French flagship L'Orient caught fire. The ship carried the fleet's entire supply of gold and ammunition, making it essentially a floating bomb waiting for ignition. As flames spread across the vessel, both British and French ships began backing away, recognizing that the explosion would be visible from several countries. L'Orient detonated at 10 o'clock with a blast that shattered windows in Alexandria 20 miles away. The explosion was so tremendous that it briefly stopped the entire battle, as sailors from both fleets paused to appreciate the sheer spectacle of a ship completely ceasing to exist. Burning debris rained down for several minutes, starting small fires on nearby vessels and generally reminding everyone involved that naval warfare could be unpredictably dramatic. Nelson watched the explosion from his quarterdeck, blood still streaming down his face, and reportedly commented that it was a sight that reminded one of the Judgment Day. His officers were less philosophical, mostly concerned with avoiding the chunks of flaming wreckage that were falling around them like apocalyptic confetti. By morning, the French fleet had been almost entirely destroyed. 11 ships had been captured or sunk, with only 4 managing to escape. Napoleon's invasion force was now stranded in Egypt, cut off from reinforcement or retreat. The victory was so complete that Nelson could hardly believe it himself, sitting in his cabin writing dispatches, while his surgeon finally managed to properly dress his head wound. The Battle of the Nile established Nelson as a national hero and confirmed his reputation for tactical brilliance combined with supernatural luck. He had disobeyed standard naval doctrine, attacked at the worst possible time, and achieved a victory so decisive that it changed the entire strategic balance in the Mediterranean. The British public was delighted, the Admiralty was impressed, and Napoleon was reportedly furious enough to throw furniture. Nelson's letters home after the battle were characteristically dramatic, filled with references to divine providence and his own miraculous survival. He described his head wound as a most severe contusion and assured Francis that he was perfectly recovered, despite the fact that he was still experiencing headaches and dizziness weeks later. The injury would leave him with a permanent scar across his forehead, which he would display like a badge of honor for the rest of his life. The victory also brought Nelson his first taste of international celebrity. Cities across Europe named streets after him, poets wrote odes to his courage, and portrait artists competed to capture his distinctive profile, complete with eye patch and battle scars. Nelson discovered that he rather enjoyed being famous, and began cultivating his image with the sort of attention to detail that most people reserved for their appearance at court. As his squadron sailed toward Naples for repairs and celebration, Nelson stood once again on his quarterdeck, his head wrapped in fresh bandages, his empty sleeve pinned to his chest. He had just achieved the greatest naval victory in British history while suffering what should have been a serious head injury. It was exactly the sort of performance that defined his career, brilliant, reckless, and just dramatic enough to become legendary. The hero of the Nile was about to discover that fame brought its own complications, particularly when combined with his tendency toward romantic melodrama and his complete inability to follow conventional social rules. But for now, sailing toward Naples with the wreckage of the French fleet scattered behind him, Nelson could enjoy the simple satisfaction of a job spectacularly well done. Naples in September 1798 welcomed Nelson like a conquering Caesar returning from his greatest triumph. The city exploded in celebration as HMS Vanguard limped into the harbour, her battle scars visible from shore. King Ferdinand threw a parade, Queen Maria Carolina wept with joy, and the entire population seemed determined to touch the uniform of the admiral who had saved them from French invasion. Nelson, still sporting fresh bandages from his head wound, found himself swept into a whirlwind of parties, presentations, and public adoration that would have exhausted a healthy man. It was during this festival of hero worship that Nelson was reunited with Lady Emma Hamilton, the wife of the British envoy, and a woman whose talent for dramatic gesture rivaled his own. Emma was 33, strikingly beautiful, and possessed of the sort of theatrical personality that could command attention in a room full of royalty. She had been born Amy Lyon, a blacksmith's daughter who had transformed herself into Lady Hamilton through a combination of beauty, wit, and strategic marriages that would have impressed Machiavelli. Nelson had first met Emma in 1793 during an earlier visit to Naples, when she was already established as Sir William's wife and the unofficial queen of Neapolitan society. That initial encounter had been brief but memorable. Nelson was still a relatively junior captain, while Emma was already famous throughout Europe for her beauty and her dramatic attitudes, classical poses that she performed at social gatherings. Now, 5 years later, the reunion between the one-eyed hero and the celebrated beauty was immediate and catastrophic. Within hours of his arrival, they were deep in conversation about art, war, and the terrible burden of greatness. Emma declared that Nelson was the savior of civilization, while Nelson found himself explaining military strategy to a woman who actually seemed to understand what he was talking about. It was a combination that proved fatal to his 20-year marriage and his reputation for conventional morality. Sir William Hamilton, Emma's husband, was a scholar and diplomat 26 years her senior, who collected antiquities and studied volcanoes with the sort of detached fascination that suggested he might not notice if his wife developed interests elsewhere. He welcomed Nelson into their household with genuine warmth, apparently delighted to host the hero of the Nile and completely oblivious to the emotional explosion developing under his own roof. The Hamilton Palazzo became Nelson's headquarters, and he settled into a routine that scandalized British society while delighting the Neapolitan court. He lived openly with Emma and Sir William in what contemporaries described as a ménage à trois, though Sir William seemed to view the arrangement more as an extended house party than a marital crisis. Nelson wrote fewer letters to Francis and more dispatches about the strategic importance of maintaining close relations with local allies. Naples had recently been liberated from French occupation, but the political situation remained chaotic. King Ferdinand wanted to march on Rome immediately, while Queen Maria Carolina favoured a more cautious approach that involved executing anyone who had collaborated with the French. Nelson found himself drawn into local politics, with his characteristic enthusiasm for complicated situations that offered opportunities for dramatic gesture. When the Neapolitan army did march on Rome, Nelson provided naval support with the sort of aggressive confidence that had served him well at the Nile. The campaign began successfully, with French forces retreating and Roman crowds welcoming Ferdinand as a liberator. For approximately 3 weeks, it appeared that Nelson had added military genius on land to his existing reputation for naval brilliance. Then the French counterattacked, and the Neapolitan army collapsed, with spectacular completeness. Ferdinand's soldiers abandoned their positions, their equipment, and their commanders with the sort of efficiency that suggested they had been planning their retreat since before the battle began. Within days, French forces were advancing on Naples itself, while Ferdinand's remaining troops seemed primarily interested in reaching home before their uniforms wore out. Nelson found himself organising the evacuation of the Neapolitan royal family, a task that required all his skills in logistics and diplomacy. The royal household included approximately 200 people, several tons of gold, and an art collection that had taken centuries to assemble. Getting them all aboard British ships while French cavalry approached the city required the sort of organisational talent that Napoleon would have admired. The evacuation was successful, but it left Nelson responsible for maintaining British influence in a city now occupied by French forces and Italian Republicans who had welcomed the invaders as liberators. When a Neapolitan Republic was declared, Nelson faced a decision that would haunt his reputation for the rest of his life, whether to treat the new government as legitimate or as a collection of traitors deserving punishment. He chose punishment with characteristic decisiveness and questionable judgment. When Ferdinand's forces eventually retook Naples, Nelson supported mass executions of Republican leaders, including Admiral Francesco Caracciolo, who had served the Republic's naval forces. The executions were carried out aboard British ships, making Nelson directly complicit in what his critics would later describe as judicial murder. Nelson justified his actions as necessary to restore legitimate government and prevent future rebellions. His supporters pointed out that the Republicans had collaborated with foreign invaders and committed treason against their rightful king. His critics noted that he had essentially used the Royal Navy to enforce political revenge, violating both international law and basic concepts of justice in the process. The controversy followed Nelson back to England when he finally returned in 1800, travelling overland through Europe with the Hamiltons in a journey that resembled a royal progress. Crowds gathered at every stop to cheer the hero of the Nile, while diplomatic observers noted the unusual domestic arrangements of the British admiral and his companions. Emma was now visibly pregnant with Nelson's child, a development that somehow escaped Sir William's attention entirely. London society received them with a mixture of fascination and horror. Nelson was undoubtedly a national hero, but his personal life had become a public scandal. He had abandoned his wife, taken up with another man's spouse, and fathered an illegitimate child while conducting what amounted to a public affair across half of Europe. The British press covered every detail with the sort of enthusiasm usually reserved for royal weddings or natural disasters. Frances Nelson responded to her husband's behaviour with dignity and devastating precision. She refused to receive Emma Hamilton in her home, declined to discuss the situation with journalists, and quietly moved into separate lodgings while maintaining her married name. When Nelson finally visited her, she reportedly told him that he could choose between that woman and his wife, but not both. Nelson chose Emma without hesitation, though he would spend the rest of his life feeling guilty about it. The domestic crisis coincided with renewed war against France, giving Nelson an opportunity to escape his personal problems through professional duty. He was given command of a squadron tasked with attacking Copenhagen, where the Danish fleet posed a threat to British commerce. It was exactly the sort of mission that suited his talents, complicated, dangerous, and offering opportunities for dramatic gesture. As he prepared for what would become another famous victory, Nelson stood in his London lodgings, contemplating the ruins of his conventional life. He had achieved everything he had dreamed of as a boy: fame, honour, and the adoration of his countrymen. He had also destroyed his marriage, scandalised society, and compromised his moral reputation in ways that would have horrified his father, the rector. But Emma was pregnant with his child, the war against France continued, and the Admiralty was offering him another chance to do what he did best: sail toward danger with the absolute confidence that providence and tactical brilliance would see him through. The hero of the Nile was about to become the hero of Copenhagen, and if his personal life resembled a theatrical tragedy, at least it was a tragedy with excellent naval battles. The child Emma carried would be born while Nelson was at sea, adding another layer of complexity to a situation that already defied conventional morality. But Nelson had long since abandoned conventional morality in favour of duty, honour, and love, not necessarily in that order. As he prepared to sail north toward Copenhagen, he was already planning his next letter to Emma, his next victory dispatch, and his next dramatic gesture in service of king and country. The spring of 1801 found Nelson sailing toward the Baltic as second in command of a fleet tasked with dissolving the League of Armed Neutrality, a coalition of northern European powers that had committed the unforgivable sin of interfering with British commerce. Denmark, Sweden, and Russia had formed this alliance to protect their merchant shipping from the Royal Navy's aggressive interpretation of maritime law, which essentially held that any ship carrying goods that might eventually reach France was a legitimate target for seizure. Admiral Sir Hyde Parker commanded the expedition, a cautious officer who believed in careful preparation, detailed reconnaissance, and avoiding unnecessary risks. Nelson served as his deputy, a position that suited his temperament about as well as a straitjacket. The two men disagreed on virtually everything, from the timing of attacks to the appropriate response to diplomatic overtures. Parker wanted to negotiate, Nelson wanted to fight. Parker saw the Danish fleet as a problem requiring careful solution. Nelson saw it as an opportunity for another glorious victory. Copenhagen's defences presented a formidable challenge that would have deterred a more reasonable commander. The Danish fleet was anchored in a line stretching along the city's waterfront, supported by massive shore batteries and protected by treacherous shoals that could ground attacking ships within range of enemy guns. The Danish crews were well trained, their ships well positioned and their commander absolutely determined to resist British demands for dissolution of the Neutrality League. Nelson studied the Danish positions with the sort of intense focus he brought to all tactical problems, identifying weaknesses that existed only because he was willing to take risks that bordered on suicidal. The Danish line could be attacked from the south, threading between shoals that most navigators considered impossible. It would require precise seamanship, exceptional luck, and the sort of calculated recklessness that had become Nelson's signature approach to naval warfare. Parker initially rejected Nelson's plan as too dangerous, preferring a more conventional assault that would minimize British casualties while maximizing the time available for diplomatic resolution. Nelson argued with characteristic passion that delay would only allow the Danes to strengthen their defences, while a bold attack would achieve decisive results before enemy reinforcements could arrive. After days of debate, Parker finally authorized the assault, though he retained overall command and the right to recall the attacking force if circumstances required. On April 2nd, Nelson led 12 ships of the line toward the Danish positions, navigating the shoals with local pilots who seemed almost as nervous as the British crews. The attack began at 10 in the morning, with British ships anchoring alongside their Danish counterparts and engaging in the sort of close-range bombardment that reduced naval warfare to its most brutal essentials. Cannonballs flew at distances measured in yards rather than miles, while musket fire swept the decks of ships locked in deadly embrace. The battle quickly became a grinding test of endurance, with both sides pouring fire into each other at point-blank range. Danish resistance was fiercer than expected, their crews fighting with the sort of desperate courage that comes from defending one's own capital city. British casualties mounted rapidly, and several ships found themselves in serious difficulty as Danish gunners found their range with increasing accuracy. It was during this crisis that Parker, watching from his flagship at a safe distance, decided that the attack was failing and raised the signal for retreat. The flags ordering withdrawal fluttered from the mainmast of HMS London, clearly visible to every ship in the British fleet. A reasonable subordinate would have acknowledged the signal and begun the complex process of extricating his squadron from the Danish guns. Nelson, however, had developed his own approach to inconvenient orders. When his flag captain pointed out Parker's signal, Nelson calmly lifted his telescope to his blind right eye and declared that he could see no such command. "I have a right to be blind sometimes," he reportedly said, continuing to direct the assault as if his commanding officer's explicit orders simply did not exist. It was insubordination, elevated to the level of performance art. The British attack continued with renewed intensity, as Nelson's ships concentrated their fire on the Danish vessels with methodical precision. One by one, the Danish ships were battered into submission, their crews exhausted by hours of continuous bombardment. The flagship Dannebrog caught fire and drifted out of the line, its commander mortally wounded and its guns silent. Other Danish vessels struck their colours or were abandoned by crews who had fought beyond the limits of human endurance. By mid-afternoon, the Danish resistance had effectively collapsed, though sporadic firing continued from the shore batteries and a few ships that had not yet received orders to surrender. Nelson, recognizing that further fighting would serve no purpose except to increase casualties on both sides, decided to end the battle through diplomacy rather than continued bombardment. He composed a letter to the Danish Crown Prince that combined tactical threat with strategic courtesy, offering to cease fire in exchange for Danish withdrawal from the Armed Neutrality League. The message was sent under a flag of truce, accompanied by one of Nelson's officers who had instructions to negotiate terms that would allow both sides to claim victory while ending the bloodshed. The Danes, faced with the choice between continued resistance and negotiated settlement, chose pragmatism over pride. The Crown Prince agreed to suspend Denmark's participation in the League, effectively dissolving the coalition that had originally threatened British commerce. The battle ended not with complete Danish surrender, but with a diplomatic agreement that achieved British objectives while allowing the Danes to maintain their honour. Nelson's tactical disobedience had achieved a decisive strategic victory, though his relationship with Parker never recovered from the incident. The commander-in-chief resented his subordinates' public defiance, while Nelson maintained that his actions had been necessary to achieve the mission's objectives. The Admiralty, pleased with the results, chose to focus on the victory rather than the methods used to achieve it. The Battle of Copenhagen established Nelson's reputation for tactical innovation and confirmed his willingness to ignore inconvenient orders when duty demanded. His use of the telescope became part of naval legend, symbolizing the sort of creative insubordination that characterized his entire career. Critics pointed out that his disobedience could have resulted in court-martial and disgrace. Supporters noted that it had instead produced another famous victory. The victory also demonstrated Nelson's growing skill at combining military force with diplomatic negotiation, achieving political objectives through carefully calibrated violence rather than simple destruction. He had learned to use battle as an instrument of policy, ending conflicts through tactical superiority rather than prolonging them through stubborn pursuit of total victory. As the British fleet sailed home from Copenhagen, Nelson could reflect on another successful campaign that had enhanced his reputation while complicating his relationship with naval authority. He had once again proven that his tactical judgment was superior to his superior's caution, though he had also demonstrated that his interpretation of military discipline remained highly personal and situational. The hero of Copenhagen returned to England as the hero of the Nile had 2 years earlier, covered in glory, slightly wounded, and absolutely convinced that Providence had personally selected him for greatness. The telescope incident became part of his legend, though it also confirmed the Admiralty's suspicion that Nelson was capable of literally anything when he believed duty required dramatic gesture. The autumn of 1805 found Europe convulsed in war, with Napoleon's armies dominating the continent while the Royal Navy struggled to maintain Britain's lifeline to the wider world. The French Emperor had assembled the Grande Armée on the Channel coast, threatening invasion of Britain itself, while Spanish and French fleets gathered in ports from Brest to Cadiz. The combined enemy force represented the greatest naval threat Britain had faced since the Spanish Armada, and the Admiralty turned inevitably to the man who had never lost a major battle. Nelson hoisted his flag aboard HMS Victory in September, joining the fleet blockading Cadiz, where Admiral Villeneuve commanded the combined Franco-Spanish force. The French admiral was under strict orders from Napoleon to break out and support the planned invasion of Britain, while Nelson waited with predatory patience for exactly such an attempt. The strategic situation favoured neither side completely. Villeneuve needed to escape the blockade, while Nelson needed to destroy the enemy fleet before it could reach the Channel. The waiting gave Nelson time to develop the tactical plan that would define his legacy and cost him his life. Traditional naval warfare called for parallel lines of battle, with opposing fleets sailing alongside each other while exchanging broadsides until one side was beaten into submission. It was a methodical approach that minimized risk, while maximizing the importance of superior gunnery and seamanship. Nelson, however, had concluded that traditional tactics were insufficient for the decisive victory Britain required. His plan was characteristically audacious. The British fleet would advance in 2 columns directly toward the enemy line, breaking through at 2 points and dividing the combined fleet into isolated segments that could be destroyed in detail. The approach would expose the leading British ships to concentrated enemy fire for an extended period, virtually guaranteeing heavy casualties among the ships that led the attack. But it would also create the conditions for complete victory, rather than tactical stalemate. Nelson explained his strategy to his captains with the enthusiasm of a professor discussing a particularly elegant mathematical proof. He called it the Nelson touch, though his subordinates recognized it as a refinement of tactics he had been developing throughout his career. The plan required exceptional seamanship, perfect coordination, and absolute trust between commanders who would be fighting largely independent actions once the battle began. On October 19th, Villeneuve finally received orders from Napoleon that brooked no further delay. Sail immediately for the Mediterranean, engaging the British fleet if necessary, but avoiding decisive battle if possible. The French admiral knew that his combined force outnumbered Nelson's fleet, but he also understood that British gunnery and seamanship were superior to his own. The escape attempt would require speed, luck, and the sort of tactical perfection that rarely survived contact with enemy action. The combined fleet left Cadiz on October 20th, sailing south toward Gibraltar in a formation that stretched across several miles of ocean. Nelson's scouts reported the enemy departure immediately, and the British fleet converged on the enemy position with the sort of methodical precision that characterized all of Nelson's operations. By dawn on October 21st, the 2 fleets were in sight of each other off Cape Trafalgar, preparing for the decisive battle that would determine the fate of Napoleon's invasion plans. Nelson spent the early morning hours completing his preparations with the sort of attention to detail that suggested he understood the magnitude of the approaching action. He inspected his flagship personally, spoke with individual gun crews, and made the rounds of his officers with words of encouragement that were part tactical briefing and part farewell address. His demeanor was calm but intense, as if he were preparing for a performance he had been rehearsing his entire career. At approximately 6 a.m., Nelson made his final appearance on Victory's quarterdeck, wearing his full-dress uniform, complete with the decorations that made him easily recognizable to both friend and enemy. His secretary and several officers urged him to cover or remove the orders and medals that would mark him as a target for enemy sharpshooters, but Nelson refused, with characteristic stubbornness. He had worn his decorations at every major battle, and he would not begin hiding them now. The famous signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty," was hoisted at 11:45 a.m. as the British fleet approached the enemy line in two columns, with Victory leading the weather column and Royal Sovereign leading the lee column. The message was Nelson's final communication to his fleet, combining patriotic appeal with tactical instruction, in a phrase that would become one of the most famous sentences in naval history. The battle began when Royal Sovereign, leading the southern column, broke through the enemy line and engaged the Spanish ship Santa Ana in close combat. The action quickly spread along both columns as British ships forced their way through the combined fleet, creating the sort of chaotic melee that favoured superior British gunnery and seamanship. Individual ship duels developed throughout the battle area, while the original enemy formation dissolved into isolated groups, fighting desperate defensive actions. Victory penetrated the enemy line at approximately 12:30 p.m., engaging the French flagship Bucentaure and the Spanish Santissima Trinidad in a close-range battle that reduced naval warfare to its most primitive elements. Nelson directed the action from his quarterdeck, moving between positions to observe different aspects of the battle, while enemy musket balls whistled around him with increasing frequency. At 1:15 p.m., a musket ball fired from the mizzen-top of the French ship Redouot struck Nelson in the left shoulder, penetrating his chest and lodging near his spine. The wound was immediately mortal. The ball had severed major blood vessels and damaged his lungs. But Nelson remained conscious long enough to understand that he was dying. His officers carried him below to the surgeon's quarters, where he would spend his final hours listening to the sounds of victory developing overhead. The battle continued for another 3 hours, with British ships systematically destroying the combined fleet in detail. Villeneuve himself was captured when Bucentaure surrendered, while other enemy ships struck their colours or attempted to escape the carnage that had overwhelmed their formation. By 5 p.m., 22 enemy ships had been captured or destroyed, with only 11 managing to reach the safety of Cadiz. Nelson died at 4:30 p.m., just as the battle was reaching its conclusion. His final words were reportedly, "Thank God I have done my duty," though witnesses gave varying accounts of his last moments. He had lived long enough to learn that the victory was complete and decisive, achieving the strategic objective that had justified his tactical sacrifice. The combined fleet had been destroyed as an effective fighting force, ending Napoleon's invasion threat and confirming British naval supremacy for the remainder of the war. The Battle of Trafalgar was Nelson's masterpiece, a tactical victory so complete that it changed the strategic balance of the entire conflict. The combined Franco-Spanish fleet ceased to exist as a military factor, leaving Napoleon dependent on land-based strategies that ultimately proved insufficient to defeat the coalition arrayed against him. British naval supremacy was established so decisively that no enemy fleet would challenge it again during the Napoleonic Wars. But the victory came at the cost of Britain's greatest naval hero, shot down at the moment of his greatest triumph by an enemy marksman who probably never knew which British officer he had killed. Nelson's death transformed a tactical victory into a national tragedy, creating a legend that would inspire British naval officers for generations, while establishing Trafalgar as one of the most famous battles in military history. As Victory sailed slowly home with her admiral's body preserved in a barrel of brandy, the British fleet could claim the most decisive naval victory in their nation's history. 22 enemy ships had been captured or destroyed, without a single British vessel lost, confirming Nelson's tactical genius while fulfilling his prediction that he would die in battle. The one-armed, one-eyed admiral had finally found the glorious death he had been seeking throughout his career, achieving immortality at the cost of his life. The immediate problem of what to do with a dead admiral in the middle of the ocean had never been adequately addressed in naval regulations. Victory's surgeon, Dr. William Beatty, found himself responsible for preserving the body of Britain's greatest naval hero during a voyage that would take several weeks to complete. The solution he devised, submerging Nelson's corpse in a barrel of brandy, was practical, efficient, and exactly the sort of detail that would horrify polite society while fascinating the general public. The brandy preservation was a makeshift solution to an unprecedented problem. Royal Navy ships normally carried only enough spirits for medical emergencies and crew rations. But Victory happened to have captured a Spanish vessel containing excellent brandy that proved suitable for temporary embalming. Nelson's body was placed in the largest available barrel, covered completely with spirits and stored in the ship's hold, while the crew attempted to process the fact that their legendary commander was now pickled like a specimen in a natural history museum. The voyage home became a peculiar combination of funeral procession and victory celebration. Victory flew the signal for a successful action, while simultaneously conducting daily ceremonies for her fallen admiral. The crew maintained their normal duties, while speaking in the subdued tones appropriate for a ship carrying the dead, creating an atmosphere that contemporary observers described as solemnly triumphant and majestically mournful. Word of Nelson's death reached England before Victory arrived, triggering a national outpouring of grief that surprised even those who understood his popularity. The British public had followed his career with the sort of personal investment usually reserved for family members, and his death felt like a national catastrophe rather than a military casualty. Church bells tolled, theatres closed, and spontaneous memorial services appeared in cities throughout the kingdom. King George III reportedly wept when informed of Nelson's death, declaring that the loss of such a hero overshadowed even the magnitude of the victory at Trafalgar. The Admiralty found itself planning both a celebration of the greatest naval triumph in British history and a funeral for the man who had made it possible. The combination of national joy and personal grief created a unique emotional atmosphere that defied conventional responses to either victory or death. Victory's arrival at Portsmouth on December 4th was met by crowds that had gathered to see both the victorious ship and the barrel containing their national hero. The transfer of Nelson's body to the Painted Hall at Greenwich became a public ceremony, with thousands of spectators lining the route to witness the passage of the man who had saved Britain from invasion. The barrel was opened with appropriate ceremony, revealing that the brandy preservation had worked perfectly, perhaps too perfectly for those who had to handle the remains. The lying in state at Greenwich lasted 3 days, during which an estimated 30,000 people filed past Nelson's coffin to pay their respects. The crowds included everyone from aristocrats to common sailors, all united in their desire to bid farewell to the man who had embodied British naval supremacy. The queue stretched for miles, with people waiting hours for the privilege of spending a few moments in the presence of their preserved hero. Lady Emma Hamilton was notably absent from the official ceremonies, her relationship with Nelson having placed her outside the bounds of respectable society despite her personal grief. She had lost the father of her child and the love of her life, but could not publicly mourn him without acknowledging the scandalous nature of their relationship. Instead, she grieved privately, while the nation celebrated the man she had known intimately, but could not claim officially. The state funeral on January 9, 1806 was designed to honour both Nelson's achievements and the magnitude of British naval power. The procession from Greenwich to St Paul's Cathedral included representatives from every branch of government and military service, with sailors from Victory carrying their admiral's coffin through streets lined with mourning crowds. The ceremony was grander than most royal funerals, reflecting Nelson's unique status as a commoner who had achieved unprecedented national importance. St Paul's Cathedral had been chosen over Westminster Abbey because its dome provided a more dramatic setting for the funeral service, and because the church could accommodate the enormous crowds expected to attend. The ceremony combined state pageantry with personal grief, as those who had known Nelson personally sat alongside officials who honoured him as a national symbol. The service itself was solemn and dignified, though several observers noted that Nelson would have appreciated the theatrical scale of his final appearance. The burial ceremony provided one final moment of drama when Victory's crew, according to tradition, folded the ship's ensign that was to be placed on the coffin. Instead of laying the flag reverently on Nelson's tomb, however, the sailors tore off a section to keep as personal memento. It was a spontaneous gesture of affection that horrified the ceremony's organizers, while perfectly capturing the relationship between Nelson and the men who had served under him. The tomb itself became a national shrine almost immediately, with visitors making pilgrimages to honor the man who had died at the moment of his greatest triumph. The inscription Horatio Nelson was considered sufficient identification. No titles or decorations seemed necessary for a man whose name had become synonymous with British naval power. The simple monument contrasted with the elaborate memorials surrounding it, reflecting the democratic nature of Nelson's appeal. The aftermath of Trafalgar confirmed Nelson's prediction that the battle would end French naval power for the remainder of the war. Napoleon's invasion plans were permanently abandoned, while British naval supremacy became so complete that enemy fleets rarely ventured from port. The victory had achieved strategic objectives that lasted decades, confirming Nelson's tactical genius while establishing the Royal Navy's dominance over global commerce and communication. Emma Hamilton's fate illustrated the personal costs of Nelson's public triumph. She inherited debts rather than wealth from her relationship with the Admiral, and spent her final years in poverty, despite having been the companion of Britain's greatest naval hero. She died in 1815, forgotten by the nation that had celebrated her lover while never accepting her own contributions to his success. Their daughter Horatio was raised by relatives who preferred not to discuss her parents' unconventional relationship. The Nelson legend continued to grow after his death, inspiring generations of British naval officers who competed to emulate his tactical brilliance and personal courage. His example became the standard by which British naval leadership was measured, creating expectations of aggressive competence that influenced naval doctrine throughout the 19th century. The phrase, "What would Nelson do?" became a serious tactical question rather than mere rhetorical flourish. The preserved correspondence between Nelson and his lovers, subordinates and superiors revealed a man whose complexity matched his public reputation for genius. His letters combined tactical insight with personal vulnerability, strategic planning with romantic poetry, and patriotic duty with human doubt. The private Nelson was as dramatic as his public persona, but also more thoughtful and conflicted than his legend suggested. By 1810, 5 years after Trafalgar, Nelson's tomb had become one of London's most visited monuments, attracting tourists from across Europe who came to honour the man who had changed naval warfare forever. His tactics were studied in naval academies throughout the world, while his example inspired officers who would never match his achievements but could aspire to his standards of professional excellence and personal courage. The one-armed, one-eyed admiral who had joined the Navy as a sickly 12-year-old had died as he had lived, dramatically, courageously, and in service to the nation that had shaped his character and benefited from his genius. He had lost an eye, an arm, and finally his life, in battles that established British naval supremacy for a century. His enemies had feared him, his superiors had tolerated him, and his crews had followed him into situations that should have been impossible to survive. Sleep well now. The battles are over, the ships are at anchor, and the waves that once carried Nelson to victory now carry only the memory of his final, perfect triumph. The man who refused to die quietly had found the glorious death he sought, leaving behind a legend that would outlast the empire he had served. Good night. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.